Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming here to this this talk for Melchin. I don't know if everyone has gotten a chance to see the New Orleans Museum of Art did a really lovely talk, an art historical talk on Melchin. So we decided to do something a little different. So tonight we have with us Cyrus Mody, who's a historian of science, technology, and engineering, who'll be speaking on Melchin in relation to the sciences of the 1970s. I didn't say my name's Daniel Atkinson, and I'm the Education and Public Programs Manager here at the CAM. So yeah, if you could all please join me in welcoming Cyrus Mody.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Daniel, for the a little bit out-of-the-box request to speak. It's been very enlightening. Okay, so as Daniel said, I'm an historian of science and technology, specifically of American science and technology in the very recent past, in the 60s and 70s, when Melchin was just getting going as a professional artist. So I think I've been asked to speak because of Melchin's abiding interest in science. Or rather, I think maybe it's fair to say Chin's recognition, or his insistence that we should each be more aware of each, and therefore his interest in science as a cultural domain that has concepts and understandings that could be made available to the culture in which science is embedded, and which at the same time could be improved by its awareness of concepts and understandings from the culture that supports it. So what I want to do today is not to talk so much about Melchin's particular engagement with science with a big S, but rather to talk about the outward-looking, engaged sciences of the 1970s and think about these practices by which scientists engaged with society in the 1970s as they may shadow or connect with or resonate with some of the art of Melchin. Okay, so where did things stand with science and technology in the 1970s, in this period when American science and technology was entering a period of ferment and turmoil, and at the same time when artists, young artists like Melchin were looking for new cultural domains to engage with? Well, to understand science, American science in this period, in the period of counterculture, in the period of ferment over civil rights in Vietnam, you have to go back a little bit to the early Cold War period, to a sort of dramatic reformation of the American scientific enterprise based on lessons learned from World War II. What you see in looking at American science in the immediate post-war period is that there was a dramatic inflation. There was much more American science after 1945 than there had been before 1941. And that inflation was largely on the basis of vast increases in federal support for a whole range of scientific disciplines. But that federal support had a very peculiar logic to it. It was really predicated on the idea that there would be a profound distinction between the kinds of science that the national security state, the military could sponsor, and the kinds of science that the civilian state could sponsor. On the one hand, military agencies were given free rein to support all different kinds of science, to support applied research that could find its way onto the battlefield or that would give some advantage in contending with the Soviets. But also, vast amounts of military money went to support very basic research, directed at fundamental, curiosity-driven questions about the basic nature of the universe. On the other hand, civilian agencies were very much constrained in what they could support. It was really treated as anathema that civilian agencies like the National Science Foundation could support applied research that would address the problems of civil society, and instead they were directed much more to this curiosity-driven, fundamental, pure research end of things. So what the kind of logic of the American scientific enterprise in the immediate post-war period is this sense that on the military end, applied research is okay, but in civil society, only research directed toward the abstract, the fundamental, the most basic elements of the universe was all right. Science that would engage with society was a little more suspect, as at least in terms of federal support. And I think you can see a kind of mirroring in post-war art as well, or at least some historians of art and some historians of science have drawn this connection that this was an era of when abstract expressionism was valorized and where a more socially engaged art was de-emphasized, and similarly, so you get art like Jackson Pollock, and similarly in terms of science you get domains like high energy physics, which were producing this very abstract, fundamental, reductionist kind of pure knowledge about the universe, but which really had trouble making any connections to solving the problems of civil society. Well, that post-war logic of science begins to crumble in the late 1960s, and it crumbles on lots of different fronts. One is just budgetary. Federal support from all sources for science in the post-war period had really skyrocketed through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, but then all of a sudden it levels off, and for almost 15 years, between about 1968 and 1983, funding is flat, right? And for scientists who had gotten used to funding rising inexorably, who had really bet the bank on that funding continued to grow forever, and who had devised research agendas around being able to purchase ever more expensive instrumentation, that leveling off of funding really was a tremendous blow that necessitated real creativity in trying to figure out how to move forward. Perhaps at a more fundamental level, though, American science in this period faced a cultural crisis. This was a period that we think of as in which American society had deep divisions over the war in Southeast Asia, over civil rights, over lots of other big matters. But one of those matters of contention in this period was the nature of science, the proper way that science should be conducted, and the proper way that science should connect to the society that supported it and embraced it. We remember this as a period of real activism on American campuses, activism often directed at matters relating to the conflict in Southeast Asia and to civil rights. But what we sometimes forget is that much of the activism on American campuses in this period was directed at demanding that American scientists change the way that they did things. So these are images of sometimes quite violent campus protests at Stanford and at MIT in this period that were directed at research reform. They were protests that were calling for American scientists to do things differently. Well, what new kind of science were these protesters imagining? They really had two big buzzwords. One was reconversion. They talked about American scientists, or they demanded that American scientists take the institutions, the infrastructures for conducting research that had been established in the early Cold War period for the purposes of the national security state, and they wanted them to reconvert those to a whole variety of more civilian-oriented projects related to environmental degradation, poverty, the decaying urban core, to developing new technologies to help people with various diseases or various disabilities, a whole broad range of topics. So the reconversion of the military-oriented infrastructure for science to a civilian-oriented infrastructure was one buzzword, and the other big buzzword of this period was so-called relevance. There was a real, over and over again, you hear people saying that scientists needed to be working on projects of more relevance to the problems of civil society, and in particular, problems related to ecology were first and foremost. But beyond just asking that scientists take up new projects, there was also a sense in this period that scientists needed to be more aware of their world. They needed to be more aware of the communities around them, for instance. You see a lot of rhetoric from campus activists in this period saying that universities needed to get out of the mode of being isolated ivory towers and instead to reach out to the communities around them, and especially poor and minority communities, physically located right next to universities, but often in very little touch with those universities. You see a lot of people saying we need to do more projects that relate to the concerns of people in these communities. We need to actually involve people from those communities. Maybe even we need to listen to people from those communities. More broadly, there was a sense that American scientists needed to be more aware of what was going on in the world, more aware of what was going on in the inner city or in the global south. And as many activists put it, they needed to be more aware of science's own complicity in what was going on in the inner city and in the global south. That request, demand for greater awareness was in some ways just kind of a manifestation of a more widespread valorization in this period of holism, of ideologies that thought of the world as composed of parts that were interconnected and mutually interdependent in very complicated ways, right? There were, over and over again, you hear campus activists saying that scientists needed to be more aware of what was going on in the inner city or in the global south because they themselves were connected to what was going on in those places. And at a more general level, this was a period in which people were keenly interested in holistic views of lots of different phenomena. Right? So this was a period, for instance, when there was a real boom of public intellectuals coming out of the field of ecology, people like Paul Ehrlich or Barry Commoner, who were really beating this drum to get Americans to understand that ecologies are made of these incredibly complicated systems of mutually interdependent beings and flows of energy and matter, and that if you do anything to one part of those ecologies, then effects will ripple away throughout the entire ecology. It's also a period in which some scientists, especially physicists, were becoming interested in these holistic, interdependent dimensions of quantum mechanics. And in particular, one group at Berkeley that became very famous called the Fundamental Physics Group, which tried to get the whole discipline of physics to understand that there were anomalies and implications within the framework of quantum mechanics that implied that all pieces of matter in the universe and maybe all conscious beings in the universe were entangled with each other, such that anything that happened to one conscious being or one piece of matter would have reverberating effects on all other pieces of matter or all other conscious beings. Partly out of interest in things like astral projection and communication with the dead, but at the same time they were pointing out aspects of quantum mechanics that really had been totally ignored in the early Cold War period because their relevance to the national security state was not seen. But as people became more interested in these holistic phenomena, these aspects of quantum mechanics came to the fore. And in particular, this fundamental physics group included people like Fritjof Capra, who were writing books like The Tao of Physics, which attempted to show that there were these resonances between these holistic implications of quantum mechanics and purported aspects of various Asian religious traditions. Okay. Now, some scientists, like this fundamental physics group, wholeheartedly embraced these new demands made on science, and were happy to engage in new ways of doing science, new topics for science. Many scientists, though, reacted quite defensively. And in both of those ways of responding to these new demands, promoted the formation of new kinds of institutions that would connect scientists and society. On the one hand, scientists who had a kind of defensive reaction to these new demands made on them wanted institutions, especially new kinds of science museums like the San Francisco Exploratorium, that would teach the public to appreciate science. That was the rhetoric that was often put out there. On the other hand, somewhat more radical scientists were looking for new ways to use the same institutions, the same new science museums, as a means to involve the public in science, or even, in a more radical sense, to create forums through these science museums that would allow the public to teach scientists to appreciate them, rather than just to have scientists teach the public to appreciate science, right? And I think you can see in the kind of tensions among these different missions confronting the new science museums of the early 1970s, between teaching the public to appreciate science, involving the public in science, and maybe even teaching scientists to appreciate the public. I think you can see some of the same tensions that also come along with museums of art, which also have to confront the same question of whether you teach the public to appreciate art, or involve the public in art, or even, I think, use art to teach the artist to appreciate the creative capacity of the public. Now, I'm drawing this parallel between art museums and science museums in this period, because this was a period when collaborations between scientists and artists really were incredibly widespread. This is an era of real optimism about the capacity of scientists and artists to work together. And I see that optimism expressed in things like a program called Experiments in Art and Technology, which brought together engineers at Bell Labs with people like Robert Rauschenberg and John Cage. I see collaborations like that in this period really as springing from this valorization of holism that I was talking about before, right? If the world is a holistic entity, where everything is mutually interdependent on everything else, then that really implies that the scientific disciplines need to work with each other, right? Because every discipline only is able to is only expert in one little part of the world. But if that one little part of the world is related to everything else, then the scientists who are expert in that one part of the world ought to be working with people who are experts on everything else. And what you see, in fact, is that this is a period in which there's a tremendous rhetoric of interdisciplinarity and also real activism to create opportunities for interdisciplinary collaboration. So, for instance, this is a graph of degree-granting interdisciplinary centers at Stanford. You can see in the early post-war period, very few such centers. Then suddenly there's a huge jump in the year of maximum protest and activism on the Stanford campus, and then a much more rapid growth in the number of these interdisciplinary centers after the peak protest year than before. And the nature of these interdisciplinary collaborations in this period is quite different than in the immediate post-war period. Early on, when people talk about interdisciplinarity, they're really talking about, materials scientists working with mechanical engineers. In the later period after 1969, what they're talking about is mechanical engineers collaborating with people in philosophy, in legal studies, in the English department, and even in the music department, right? And so what you see is that people aren't just saying we need interdisciplinarity, but we need the widest ranging kind of interdisciplinarity imaginable, right? And what could be more wide-ranging a kind of interdisciplinarity than computer scientists working with John Cage, electrical engineers working with Robert Rauschenberg, or ecologists working with someone like Mel Chin. Okay, so what I've presented thus far is a kind of general overview of some of the trends converging in the early 1970s that I think form a background for a young artist like Mel Chin to have been interested in what was going on in science and trying to appropriate some of the concepts and understandings that scientists had developed. What I want to turn to now is to look in particular at the field that was probably most accommodating to this new idea of how to do science, and that in some ways propelled this new way of doing science in the late 1960s. And that's the field of cybernetics. Now, what is cybernetics? Well, to get at that, as with lots of other fields in this period, you have to go back to World War II. And in particular, you have to go back to the MIT mathematician Norbert Wiener, who was assigned the task of developing a new way of tracking enemy bombers automatically, and then using that tracking device to then compute trajectories for anti-aircraft fire, right? So a device that would automatically see enemy bombers and then shoot them down. So Wiener began to build a model of an anti-aircraft observer and an incoming bomber, in which the observer scans its environment, sees the bomber, and outputs some reaction to that environment, fires off a shell, that then forms a new part of its environment the next time that it's scanning that environment, right? So in the initial go-round, all the observer can see is the bomber, but then in the next go-round, it sees the bomber plus the anti-aircraft shell, right? What Wiener soon realized is that you can flip that around and think about it from the perspective, in exactly the same way, from the perspective of the bomber, right? The bomber flies over enemy territory, it scans its environment, it outputs some reaction to that environment. It releases a bomb, it strafes a position, it fires at an enemy fighter, it takes evasive action, or whatever, right? And what Wiener soon realized from building little gadgets that would emulate this is that even if you understand each of the little black boxes in this system entirely, right? You've built them from scratch. The system as a whole can behave very unpredictably, right? That's sort of the point, right? It's in the rule set of the bomber to behave unpredictably so that it doesn't get shot down. It's in the rule set of the observer to not telegraph how they're going to fire off their anti-aircraft shells. And that's just in a very simple system with two black boxes interacting with each other. In any real-world situation, you have lots and lots of different black boxes. You have lots of bombers, you have lots of civil defense spotters, radar systems, anti-aircraft guns, fighter command, etc. Right? All scanning their environment, reacting to that environment, and in their reactions to that environment, forming the environment that the other black boxes in this system are reacting to. Right? Well, so this becomes very complex very quickly, very unpredictable very quickly. So how do you deal with that unpredictability? Well, Wiener's big insight is that you can take any of the black boxes in this system and open them up, and inside that black box you'll see a new cybernetic system made of other black boxes, right? You can go up or down in scale, and the system looks very similar each time you open up one of these black boxes. Right? So, for instance, within an incoming bomber, you have a set of crew members, each of whom are scanning their environment through their eyes, through bomb sights, through headphones, and at the same time are outputting various reactions to that environment. They're speaking into their communicators, they're releasing their bombs or whatever, and each of their reactions to their environment is then forming a part of the environment for each other, right? Similarly, within any of those crew members, the crew member is made up of different parts that are scanning their environment, right? The eyes, the ears, the hands, and so forth. And then allowing the crew member to compute some reaction to what they see in the environment, and then output a reaction to that environment through the actions of eyes, head, hands, etc., that in turn forms part of the environment for themselves and for the other members of the crew in turn. And you can go all the way up and all the way down, opening up these black boxes, right? You know, if you go upwards, you have various national economies and militaries that are scanning their environments and reacting to each other. Even further up, you have, you know, planets forming part of the gravitational environment that affects and is affected by other heavenly bodies. If you go further down inside the crew members, you know, each of them is composed of, you know, each of them has different organs, which is composed of different cells that are communicating chemically in a similar way, and so on and so forth, right? So Wiener's big insight was not that you could build these systems composed of black boxes that interact with each other, but rather that you could open up each black box and find another cybernetic system inside, right? And that therefore you could draw analogies across lots of different scientific disciplines, right? That each scientific discipline is expert in a cybernetic system at some different scale. But the cybernetic systems all operate in somewhat analogous ways, right? And therefore someone interested in atomic physics, economics, gravitation, all of these people could talk a similar kind of cybernetic language. In particular, Wiener began a collaboration with a Mexican neurophysiologist, Arturo Rosenbluth, and Rosenbluth literally was able to diagnose some of the pathologies of Wiener's little gadgets that would emulate an anti-aircraft system and an incoming bomber by pointing out resemblances between their behavior and the behavior of animal neurons, right? That in turn meant that after the war, as Wiener began to popularize this cybernetic language, he really looked for collaborators across lots and lots of different scientific disciplines. He was aided by something called the Macy Foundation, which helped put together a series of conferences in the immediate post-war period to kind of chart out what cybernetics would be. And the participants in these Macy conferences came from all over the place, from math, from physics, from neurophysiology, from logic, from psychiatry, anthropology, psychology, neurophysiology, and so forth, right? So you should be getting a sense by now of some of the ways in which cybernetics would afford a very easy response to, would be very compatible with these demands for a new way of doing science that gathered such force in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It conceived of itself as an inherently interconnected and interdisciplinary field, and therefore cyberneticians and the activists demanding a new kind of science in the late 1960s were able to find a lot of areas of compatibility. One area of compatibility is that the cyberneticians were very fond of going outside conventional channels of communicating scientific ideas, right? They had this new way of doing science that they hoped would erase all of the traditional scientific disciplines. So many of the traditional scientific disciplines weren't very happy with them. So they found it sometimes difficult to publish in traditional scientific outlets like journals. And so they really tried to short circuit the official scientific outlets by going through more popular media. And in fact, Wiener and many other cyberneticians wrote popular books that propagated out through society, ended up in secondhand bookstores, and then found their way into the hands of people like John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, Brian Eno, and became real Bibles for a new way of doing art, music, some cybernetically inspired form of creativity. I think you can see that a little bit in Mel Chin's attempts to short-circuit some of the conventional modes of communicating about art. Second, one of the places that cybernetic thinking spread fastest was into the field of ecology. The nuclear age had brought new ways to trace complex flows of matter and energy through ecological systems, while cybernetics offered a way of thinking about ecosystems as composed of these complexly interlinked black boxes, each feeding back on each other. And what you see in the 1960s is the development of this very rich visual language of ecology depicting these complex flows of energy and matter around ecosystems that was then taken up by many artists, including Mel Chin. Third, the analogy between anti-aircraft trackers and brains that Rosenbruth had originally given to Wiener led many of the cyberneticians to build these kind of funny gadgets that then they would let loose in environments to see in what unpredictable ways these gadgets would interact with those environments, right? So they really took this kind of gadgeteering aspect of Wiener's early cybernetics and they ran with it, right? So for instance, this is a guy named Gray Walter who built these little tortoises that then he would release into the environment. And you can see this is a time-lapse view that shows they behave very strangely, right? Even though the tortoise itself is quite simple, its behavior is quite complex. Almost certainly the most influential of these cybernetic gadgets is something called the Homeostat, built by a British psychologist named Ross Ashby. Homeostat is very simple. Basically, it's a bank of voltmeters that are connected to each other, usually just 4 voltmeters connected to each other in some complicated way, where the outputs of the other voltmeters influence the current state of 1 voltmeter. Right? So each of the voltmeters is feeding back on the others, right? And when each of them is programmed in such a way that when the inputs from the other voltmeters reach different levels, then their output changes, right? So that means that they're interacting in these very unpredictable ways, even though each voltmeter itself is quite simple. Now, one important feature of most runs of these homeostats is that after a while they would sort of settle into these equilibria where their output wouldn't change very much for very long periods of time, and then all of a sudden they would all change very rapidly and reset at some new equilibrium. Ashby thought of this as very closely analogous to the working of the human mind. And he thought that human minds could fall into good or bad equilibria, right? He thought that if you had a patient who was in a bad equilibrium, then you could apply some kind of shock, usually insulin shock or electroshock in this period, and that would get them, like the homeostat, to reset into some new equilibrium. Now I think there are a couple different connections to Mel Chin here. One is this bears a, I assume, quite coincidental, but striking resemblance to some of the descriptions I've read of his period of non-responsiveness in his teenage years. It sounds quite a bit like the behavior of one of these homeostats. The other is that this idea of these of punctuated equilibrium, of these systems that would not change very much for a long time and then that would suddenly reset in a radically different way, flowed in the late 1960s and early 1970s into evolutionary biology in the ideas of Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould about punctuated equilibrium in evolutionary systems, where a species may have the same form for a very, very long time and then all of a sudden reset in a radically different form. And from what I've read, this is an idea that seems to have had a real influence on Mel Chin. One perhaps related place to look for some resonance between cybernetics and Mel Chin's work is in the intersection between ecological and technological, especially architectural thinking in the 1960s and 1970s around a common cybernetic language. There were many ecological figures in this period who talked about the Earth as this closed, mutually interdependent system where ecologies don't output from the system and where everything in the system is related to everything else. And they made explicit analogies in this period to artificial closed systems, the most famous of which, of course, is the space capsule, a closed system where nothing can get in or out and where everything inside the system has to be kept in an interdependent equilibrium. And in fact, the word cyborg, meaning cybernetic organism, is developed at NASA in this period to describe the astronaut as an organism in some sort of cybernetic feedback with his, in this period, space capsule. But of course, there were other variants of this as well, most famously Buckminster Fuller's idea of spaceship Earth, the Earth as this massive object analogous to a space capsule, or NASA's contractor James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, this idea of the Earth as this cybernetic system that could keep itself in some kind of more or less perpetual equilibrium. Within both the space program and modernist architectural circles in this period, there were attempts to apply this space capsule ecology analogy built on common cybernetic language to human terrestrial dwellings, to apartment complexes, to mobile homes, and even perhaps to whole cities. And I think you get some sense of that in some of Mel Chin's work on a new kind of ecologically minded urban architecture. Okay, what I want to close with are two probably the most durable aspects of cybernetics heritage that arise in this period. One in the area of computing and the other more in the area of social media. So in terms of computing, it's important to go back to the original Wiener model of the ground observer and the bomber, and to understand that in that system, each of the black boxes are actually composed of a human complemented by a whole range of technologies, right? The ground observer has a radar system, a radio, binoculars, an anti-aircraft gun, and so forth. And similarly for the crew in the incoming bomber. One path that some people inspired by cybernetics in this period took, therefore, was to say, well, how can we create systems where the human and the technology can actually co-construct each other, right? And most famously, they started to talk about the computer as a technology that we could construct, but which would then construct us, right? We would build computers, but computers would augment our cognitive capacity, which would allow us to build better computers, which would augment our cognitive capacity, and so on and so forth. And to simplify things just a little bit, it's that line of cybernetics from this period that gave us things like the mouse, the graphical user interface, networking, email, some other stuff that we don't use like the chord key set rather than the keyboard, but a whole range of aspects of the personal computer that today we take for granted, but which really came out of this cybernetically minded view that you could create a computer or a computer system as a kind of pedagogical technology, where the individual user through the computer would create some personalized environment that would augment their cognitive capacity, that would make them more aware of the world in some deep sense, and that would allow them to be a more knowing subject, right? A kind of view of how we interact with personal computing devices and virtual environments that you can see all over the place today, but even in some areas of modern art. The social media story about computing, about cybernetics that I want to end with, dovetails with some of this work in personal computing, but also, oddly enough, goes through a revolution in publishing that was going on in this period. And to understand why, you have to think a little bit about the politics of cybernetics. Many young people in this period really liked cybernetics because it had, they thought, the ability to overturn traditional hierarchical systems in lots of different domains, right? So they liked the personal computer, for instance, because it overturned the hierarchical system of computing where you went to a single company, IBM, and bought their computer, and they told you how to use the computer. And then to actually use the computer, you had to go take your punch cards to some centralized facility, and then a week later you would get those punch cards back, right? Instead, with a personal computer, you could interact with the computer in your own idiosyncratic way without being beholden to that hierarchy, right? Similarly, in education, they wanted to do away with traditional lectures and instead promote an environment where the teacher and the student would co-evolve. There are even cybernetic psychologists in this period who were very much beloved by the counterculture, people like R.D. Laing and Gregory Bateson, who wanted a cybernetic form of psychology and psychiatry, where instead of the doctor telling the patient how to think, instead the doctor and the patient would regenerate each other. Well, something similar happened in the way cybernetics was taken up in publishing, right? If you think about traditional publishing, someone issues a book or a newspaper, and I read it, and I'm just supposed to believe what I've read, right? But a cybernetic form of publishing would issue documents that people would react to, and then their reactions would be taken up in the further iterations of that publication, right? And the most famous example from this period was the Whole Earth Catalog, where each iteration of the catalog would incorporate readers' responses to the previous iteration of the catalog. Readers themselves were making the Whole Earth Catalog in this cybernetic fashion. As you can see, they were explicitly pointing to cybernetics as one of their intellectual forebears. Well, eventually, the Whole Earth Catalog evolved into something called the Whole Earth Electronic Link, one of the early prototypes of social media. And it inspired things like Wired Magazine and the Electronic Frontier Foundation and other early forms of social media and internet fora. And indeed, if you think about what we have today on the internet, Wikipedia and Facebook and so forth, these are profoundly cybernetic, or they appear to be, profoundly cybernetic ways of circulating and personalizing knowledge, right? Each of us sits at the center of some unique knowledge environment which we can scan and which we affect, and then which forms part of the knowledge environment for everyone else. Some of the old elements of knowledge are still durable, as in the old hierarchical media such as encyclopedias, but now we take it for granted that we can refashion those hierarchical media in ways that are personally suited to our own interests and needs. Okay, so I think I'm going to end there. Hopefully that's given you some sense of the kind of context of science in the 1970s that would have perhaps given a young artist like Mel Chin the idea that science science was a cultural domain that he could be in interaction with, and in particular, that cybernetics, the language of cybernetics, the ideals of cybernetics, might have equal relevance, not just for technical domains, but also for domains of creativity and art. Thanks.